the fact that this is kind of a similar exploitation of the cultural anxiety that he engaged in. Do you mind just drawing some parallels to campuses in the 50s and in the 60s at this time and what's happening today?
Absolutely. Well, I think a lot of the crux of, and I use the word reactionary because I think it's a little bit more specific, and I think a lot of self-described conservative politics about college campuses is really what I call reactionary. And a pretty standard political science definition there is a movement that wants to say, okay, we've had enough change. We've had enough expansions of rights, and culture has become open enough. And now we have to start putting limits on that or roll it back. They're reacting to change in a backward-looking notion. So I think we're in an era then of what I call ongoing desegregation. We're not in a post-segregation era with respect to publicly funded education and even private Ivy League education. A lot of what was going on in Buckley's time, if we think about his idea that college campuses are too liberal, that just doesn't live up to an understanding basically of what college campuses were like at that time. In the 50s, 60s, only until recently, there was a change where college campuses, very historically recently in the US, used to be primarily reserved for cultural and economic elites, primarily women, people of color were largely systemically barred from those communities, and we can go on down the list. In Buckley's time, college meant more like almost exclusively Ivy League or sort of distinguished state institutions. And so I think, interestingly, the parallel is that we have a lot of messages now about saying, whoa, college campuses have become too diverse and so forth. When you just start to get those percentages, we're really just within a generation or two where there are significant amounts on many university campuses of people of color, of people openly identifying as being from the LGBTQ community, international student populations. The irony is then that a lot of these messages are reactionary, as I describe them, because they sound like those things that people like Buckley and all kinds of radio hosts and ideologues were saying to resist segregation in the 50s, desegregation, in the 50s and 60s. And now we're in an era where we're truly, historically speaking, just starting to get something like a more authentically diverse, representative, and fact-based, for that reason, free speech, all these different people, these communities, we're approaching something like a more diverse meritocracy and trying to attain it. And that's where I think the reactionary kickback comes from, and why it seems so reminiscent of some of those pro-segregationist ideas from the 50s and 60s to keep university education exclusive and out of reach for many people.
I mean, you can see that in the two Supreme Court decisions that we just saw. The overturning of Biden's student debt cancellation and the affirmative action one. We want to keep these universities as institutions of capitalistic reproduction, as opposed to ones that are more emancipatory or allow for more diverse opinions and diverse people to have success. It's re-stratifying those lines. And I mean, you talk about this in the context of even the war on education more broadly with the anti-CRT stuff. And I would put "Don't Say Gay" in there as well, and the other that kind of legislation. Can you talk about how rapidly the war on colleges and universities, the free speech stuff, trickled into legislation about public education broadly down to, kids in kindergarten and K through 12?
Absolutely. It was quite rapid. So as I mentioned, I started being concerned about hearing all these messages about what's allegedly happening on campuses, and then it just not resembling the profession as I understood it very much at all. That was in about 2017, 2018, as I mentioned. And when I was revising the book and it was going to press last year, I have notes in there about things that were just starting to happen in the Florida legislature under Ron DeSantis. But really, we're living, and that's why I say it's sort of an ongoing struggle to fully desegregate campuses. You've had a lot of activity for several years now. There is a crisis of free speech and academic freedom in publicly funded education, and the crisis is not coddled undergraduate students. It's increasing political interference with what should be free, relatively self-governing academic affairs. And so I mentioned in the book, for years now, the Goldwater Institute, a hyper-partisan think tank, has been marketing in political circles, politically marketing all kinds of draft legislation that now, not only in Florida, it's also being adopted through numerous state legislatures. And I think it's very important for listeners to understand that, as you mentioned, the K through 12 education, you have these just broad slogans now, the idea that students in K through 12 are being ideologically indoctrinated. There's no teaching going on, or that they're digesting critical race theory, or it's being forced upon them, or that they're being sexualized by teaching about the full spectrum of gender and sexual diversity and humanity from a fact-based perspective. All these claims were first beta tested about college campuses. So the disturbing thing for democracy, as well as K through 12 education, is that when you have these anti-university messages, they become a good engine for generating these political pretexts. And now we have a historically significant wave of outright state censorship in these state legislatures. My objection to them is not because it's primarily from one political party. My objection to them is because it's anti-democratic, it's anti-academic, it puts a brake on basic liberties. And so there you have really a crisis now in what, if you look at kind of what a lot of scholars describe as K through 12 education, in addition to higher education, these are some of the most democratic spaces in the country because they're governed by locally elected officials. You can go to your school board, but just like on college campuses, now we have provocateurs and propagandists trying to gum up the works of what's in US culture, one of our, relatively speaking, more open and self-governing forms of institutional decision-making.
Well, really appreciate your time today. Bradford Vivian, professor in the Department of Communication, Arts, and Sciences at Penn State, author of the book Campus Misinformation, The Real Threat to Free Speech in American Higher Education. We will put a link to the book in the description of this show, wherever you're listening or watching this, and at majority.fm. I'd recommend it as, like, my favorite kind of book giving is passive aggressive book giving. And this is a perfect one for anyone in your family that might have bought into some of this crap, especially if they're, kind of centrist people. So it's on my list. Appreciate your time, Brad. Thank you.
Thank you very much.